The last thing they said before the convoy pulled out was this: "Leave her, she's support. She won't make it through the night." 92 enemy fighters, 1 outpost, 1 defender, and she was already bleeding before the first shot was fired. They left her because they thought she was nothing, a quiet woman with silver hair and a file-stamped non-combat, buried under a decade of deliberate forgetting. They left her because leaving her was easy, and easy decisions are what cowards make when the clock is running. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was what that file used to say before someone rewrote it. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell, because this channel doesn't tell comfortable stories. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels, and if this hits you the way it hits me, leave a like before we're done. This is the story of the soldier they wanted the world to forget. The base had been dying for weeks before the order came to kill it officially. Viper Ridge wasn't much to look at even in its operational prime. A cluster of prefab structures hammered into the hardpan of a high desert plateau, surrounded by HESCO barriers stacked too deep and a perimeter fence that rattled like loose teeth in the wind. It sat at roughly 4,200 feet elevation, which meant the air was thin and cold at night and brutal by afternoon, the sun pressing down with the specific cruelty of high-altitude desert where there was no moisture to soften it. The base had been built to service a corridor that mattered, a mountain pass that funneled movement between 2 contested zones, a natural choke point the planners had flagged as strategically critical 18 months ago. Now, 18 months later, the corridor had been deemed less critical, or the political will to hold it had evaporated, or both. The official language in the evacuation order was reallocation of forward assets, which was the military's way of saying we're leaving and we'd rather not discuss why. The evacuation had taken 43 hours. 43 hours of convoys grinding out through the main gate, of equipment being stripped and loaded, of soldiers who'd spent months complaining about Viper Ridge suddenly finding things to miss about it. The generators, the modular kitchen that made passable coffee, the specific quality of silence on a watch shift at 0300 when the desert was cold and still and the stars came out so hard and bright they looked fake. By the morning of the final convoy, what was left was a gutted shell. And Sergeant Maya Callahan. She was standing at the motor pool when Lieutenant Colonel Graves made the decision, watching the last of the MATVs get staged for departure, her eyes moving across the vehicles with the automatic habit of someone assessing load weight and fuel states. She was doing this because it was her job to what? Had been her job for the past 3 years, managing the logistics and security of equipment on a base that was now ceasing to exist. Graves walked past her twice before he stopped. He was a broad man, the kind of officer who'd been athletic once and kept the frame, but lost the conditioning somewhere around lieutenant colonel. He had a habit of talking through people rather than to them, his gaze landing somewhere over your shoulder like he was addressing an audience you couldn't see. Callahan. He said her name the way you'd say the name of a piece of furniture you'd decided to leave behind. "You're not on the manifest." She turned from the vehicles. "Sir?" "Final manifest, you're not on it." She held his gaze for a moment. "There's been a mistake. My name should be on—" "No mistake." He pulled out a tablet, showed her the screen without actually handing it to her. "Logistics coordinator for Viper Ridge remains in place pending final transfer of base assets to the receiving unit. That's your role. That's what you're staying for." "The receiving unit isn't scheduled for 72 hours, sir. You know that." "Then you'll have 3 days of quiet." The way he said it, you'd think he was doing her a favor. 3 days of quiet, like she should thank him for it. She didn't thank him. She looked at the tablet, at the name that wasn't on the manifest, and then she looked back at Graves with the same flat expression she'd been wearing since she transferred to Viper Ridge. The expression that made people decide she was simple or hollow, or both. "Sir, there's chatter in the last 48 hours. The Valley Access Road has been assessed," he said. "Clipped. Final. The threat level does not require additional personnel to remain." The threat level was assessed by someone who isn't staying. That landed wrong. She watched him register it, the slight tightening around the eyes, the way his jaw shifted. "Sergeant Callahan." His voice dropped half a register. "You are a logistics coordinator. You are not an intelligence analyst. You are not a tactical planner. You are not, he paused for weight, a combat asset. Your assessment of the threat level is not something I'm factoring into this decision. Behind him, two of the convoy commanders had stopped pretending not to listen. Maya said nothing. Graves took her silence for acceptance, the way people like him always did. There's a working radio in the TOC. Emergency frequencies are marked. You'll be fine. He was already turning away. We'll have eyes on the valley from the UAV package. If anything develops, we'll know. We'll know. Not we'll respond. Not we'll come back. Just, we'll know. She watched him walk to the lead vehicle. Watched him climb in without looking back. Watched Captain Ethan Cross, young, sharp-featured, the one officer on this base who'd actually spoken to her like a human being in the last 6 months, jog up to Graves's vehicle and say something urgent through the window, his body language tight and pressing. Graves's window went up. Cross stood there for 3 seconds, watching the glass, then turned and found Maya across the motor pool with his eyes. Something passed across his face that she couldn't fully read. Not quite guilt, not quite pity. Something in between that was worse than either. He raised one hand in a gesture that might have been apology, might have been farewell, and then he was moving to his own vehicle. The convoy pulled out at 0614. By 0622, Viper Ridge was silent. Maya stood in the motor pool for a while after the engine sounds faded, listening to the desert fill the absence. Wind through the fence, the creak of a sign somewhere that nobody had taken down, the distant sound of something, a bird maybe, that seemed out of place at this altitude. Then she went to work. Tuts. She started with the inventory because that's what you do when everything else is out of your hands. You find the things you can control, and you control them precisely. The TOC, the Tactical Operations Center, a reinforced prefab that had served as the brain of Viper Ridge, was stripped down to its bones. The main comms rack was gone. The tactical displays were gone. What remained was a secondary radio console bolted to the far wall, old enough to have actual physical dial indicators instead of digital readouts, and a shelf of laminated cards with emergency frequencies, a folding chair, a cot that someone had left pushed into the corner with a sleeping bag still on it. Maya sat in the folding chair and pulled up the emergency frequency. Static. She moved through 3 channels, listening, and on the 4th she heard what she'd been hearing for 2 days in the background of regular chatter. Fragmentary transmissions on a frequency adjacent to the standard enemy monitoring band. The kind of thing that could be atmospheric interference or could be something else entirely. She'd flagged it twice. Both times she'd been told it was interference. Now she was alone with it, and she had time, and she listened for 40 minutes straight. The fragments were in a dialect she only partially understood. Her language training was functional, not expert, but she caught enough. Movement references. A grid that she cross-checked against the base map and felt her stomach drop when she saw what it pointed toward. Timing language that she'd heard before in a different context, a different desert, a different life. She gave herself exactly 60 seconds to think about the fact that she was alone on an empty base with a single secondary radio and no backup, and that the people who should be hearing this were 30 clicks south in convoy. Then she stopped thinking about it and went to the armory. The armory was in a low concrete structure near the east wall, the kind of building designed to be unremarkable. No windows, a heavy door with a dual lock mechanism, the exterior painted the same flat tan as everything else on the base. The departing unit had stripped the primary weapons storage. She'd watched them do it, had signed the transfer paperwork herself, had noted with the automatic precision of her role that the numbers matched. Except for one locker. It was in the back, floor-mounted, a heavy-gauge steel unit that predated the current base configuration by at least 8 years. The locking mechanism was an older system, keyed rather than coded, and the key was on a ring that had been hanging on a hook in the TOC under a faded label that read, "Legacy Storage, Do Not Discard." Maya had noticed it 3 months ago and filed a report about it. The report had been acknowledged and filed somewhere and nothing had happened because nothing about Viper Ridge got resolved, it just accumulated. She unlocked the locker. Inside was equipment registered under a name she recognized. Her own. Not her current name in the system. Not Sergeant Maya Callahan, Logistics Coordinator, FOB Viper Ridge. The other name. The registration attached to a service record that had been reclassified, the one that referenced a unit designation she was no longer officially connected to, and a series of field evaluations that didn't match anything in her current file. The rifle was an HK-417, a designated marksman's rifle chambered in 7.62 by 51 millimeters NATO, not a standard issue weapon, not something you'd find in a base armory unless someone had specifically put it there and specifically left it registered under a specific name. The optic mounted on it was a Schmidt and Bender with a first focal plane reticle. There was a suppressor in a separate case. There were 12 loaded magazines in a padded tray, 168 grain match hollow point, the kind of ammunition you used when the shot had to count. Below the rifle were other things. A plate carrier configured to her measurements. Not standard, not off the shelf. The plate's ceramic composite in a cut she recognized as custom to a unit that officially didn't exist. A medical kit. Night vision monocular. Generation 3. Helmet mounted. A handheld radio on a frequency she would need to program herself. She stood in front of the open locker for a long moment. Then she started getting dressed. It took her 40 minutes to configure the equipment and another 20 to do a full sweep of the base, moving building to building with the HK in hand, indexing corners the way she'd been trained to do in a time before Viper Ridge, before logistics, before the incident that had ended one version of her life and begun the slow, quiet burial of another. She categorized what she had. The base perimeter was roughly 400 meters on the long axis, 280 on the short. 4 hardened fighting positions at the corners, sandbag and HESCO construction, protected approaches, good fields of fire, but no overlapping coverage on the northeast sector where there was a fold in the terrain that created dead ground. The departing unit had not prioritized fixing this because fixing it would have required work, and they'd known they were leaving. She prioritized fixing it now. She spent 40 minutes moving sandbags and repositioning a piece of metal sheeting to redirect the field of view, her shoulders burning by the end of it, sweat cutting cold channels through the dust on her face. She identified 6 IED pre-position points along the most likely approach routes, places where the terrain naturally funneled movement and where a prepared defender could create delay. She had limited materials, but she had some: engineering stakes, wire, a collection of noisemakers she'd improvised from materials in the maintenance shed, and 2 actual claymore mines that had been left in a side room of the armory with a paperwork tag indicating they were scheduled for disposal. They were not disposed of. She emplaced them on the south approach, 40 meters out, overlapping kill zones, tripwire initiators backed up by manual clickers. She memorized the exact locations because she would be moving in the dark and she could not afford to forget. By mid-afternoon, she had a rough defensive scheme. It was not good. One person defending 400 meters of perimeter was not defensible by any reasonable military standard, but defensible and survivable were different problems, and survivable was the one she was actually solving. She went back to the TOC and spent an hour on the radio, trying every frequency and combination she knew. The emergency channel was active but unmonitored. She heard the automated relay signal, but no human response. The tactical channels the convoy would be using were outside her radio's range from this position, or being relayed through a repeater that had been shut down, or both. The UAV package Graves had mentioned, the eyes on the valley he'd promised, had apparently not included any provision for the person left in the valley to communicate with them. She tried for an hour. Then she stopped trying and started preparing. The first sign came at 1847. She was on the north wall when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong, low and mechanical, the kind of ambient engine noise that the desert swallowed at distance but couldn't completely erase. She brought the HK up and glassed through the optic, moving slowly across the approaches, and found the dust signature first, a thin line of disturbed air rising from behind a ridgeline 2,000 meters to the northeast. She watched it for 4 minutes. Then the dust signature multiplied. She counted vantage points: north ridge line, eastern slope, the dry wash to the west that she'd flagged in her threat assessment. Movement in all 3 sectors, staged, deliberate. Not a patrol, not a reconnaissance element. Something that had been planned, coordinated, which meant something that had intelligence. Intelligence about this base, about who was left on it. She felt her chest tighten, not with fear exactly, but with the specific physical sensation of a situation compressing, possibilities narrowing, options reducing to the ones that actually mattered. She'd felt it before, in a different desert, with different terrain and different stakes, and a team of 7 instead of just herself. The team of 7 was why she was here, now, alone on this wall. She pushed the thought away. She got on the radio one more time, emergency channel, any channel, cycling through everything she had. Any station, this is Viper Ridge. I have multiple inbound contacts. I say again, multiple inbound contacts at Viper Ridge, requesting immediate static. The automated relay clicking back at her. Nothing human. She set the radio to transmit continuously on the emergency channel, a beacon rather than a conversation, and went to her first position. Boo! The first light was failing when they moved. She had her estimated count by then. She'd been watching the staging for 2 hours, tracking movement signatures, and her number was somewhere between 85 and 95. She fixed it at 92 in her mind because she needed a number she could work with, and 92 had a specific psychological weight to it. Not a round number, not an approximation, something precise that reminded her this was real. 92. She was in the designated marksman position she'd selected on the roof of the TOC, the highest point on the base, prone on a poncho liner she'd found in the cot room, the HK on a bipod, her night vision monocular clipped to her non-dominant eye, and her dominant eye on the optic. The sky had gone the color of a bruise in the west. Temperature was dropping fast the way desert temperature did, the warmth of the day pulling back like a tide. The radio crackled. Viper Ridge, this is static. Do you copy? Her heart moved. She keyed the transmitter. Viper Ridge copies. I need a status on more static, the transmission fragmenting. She caught 2 words clearly, received and something that might have been assess. And then nothing. She didn't know if anyone was coming. She made herself accept that she didn't know and moved on. The first figure crested the ridgeline at 1,900 meters, a silhouette in her NVG monocular, moving with the loose confidence of someone who believed they were walking into an empty base. Behind him, more. She watched them spread into their approach formation, a standard assault configuration designed for multiple entry points, and she made herself wait, identifying the one that mattered. The person moving differently from the others, the one that the others angled toward slightly when they adjusted their spacing, the one who was slightly behind the lead element rather than in it. Command element. Position to observe, not to be first through the wire. 2,200 meters. Breathing. 2,100 meters. She settled the crosshairs on the correct point of the silhouette. 15 seconds. She squeezed the trigger with the patience of someone who had done this in conditions worse than this, in darkness more complete than this, with more noise and chaos and physical damage than anything the present moment offered. The suppressor reduced the report to something that would not carry to the attacker's ears at this range. The recoil was what it always was. Sharp, familiar, honest. The figure dropped. The effect was not immediate in the sense that the remaining force didn't scatter and run, but there was a pause, a specific particular pause that she recognized. The pause of a force that has just realized something is wrong with their understanding of the situation. The pause that cost seconds, and sometimes seconds were everything. She was already moving before the pause ended. From his position in the lead convoy element, 31 kilometers south on the main supply route, Captain Ethan Cross heard the emergency beacon click into his radio with the soft insistence of a problem he'd been waiting for. He keyed his handset. Dispatch, this is Bandit 6. I'm getting an emergency signal from Viper Ridge grid. What's your status on that? 30 seconds of silence. Bandit 6, we have the signal. We're assessing. She's alone up there, Cross said. Not a report. Just a statement of fact into the radio to whoever was listening. Whatever that assessment is, she's alone. Nobody answered. Cross looked out the vehicle window at the dark desert, at the direction he'd come from. and felt the specific nausea of a decision he hadn't made but was complicit in anyway. Back at Viper Ridge, Maya had already fired her second shot. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead. She'd hit the corner of the HESCO barrier moving off the TOC roof in the dark, and she hadn't stopped to address it because stopping was not the current priority. The current priority was the 47 men now moving on the east wall, the 31 coming up from the south wash, and the 14 she'd lost visual on entirely, which meant they were doing something she hadn't predicted yet, which meant she needed to think faster than her body wanted her to. She pressed the field dressing against her forehead with one hand, held it there for 10 seconds, and then taped it in place with the medical tape from her kit. She could feel the warmth of the blood already soaking through. She didn't look at it. She moved to position 3, went prone, and got back on the rifle. Through the optics, she watched the east wall assault element stop, 2 of them bending over something on the ground, both of them suddenly very still. She'd emplaced a noisemaker wire at 20 meters from the wall, and in the silence of the desert night, the sound of it snapping taut would carry. What carried more was the sudden conviction, moving through that assault element, that the dark in front of them was not empty. She heard one of them say something. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. She made out the tone. The tone said, "We thought this place was abandoned." The tone said, "Who is shooting at us?" And somewhere behind the east wall assault element, passing voice to voice in the way that military formations communicated when they were starting to get nervous, a question was forming that she would not learn about until later. Not until a recovered communications device was analyzed by an intelligence unit that would spend 6 weeks cataloging what had been said in those final moments before the next shot came. The question was simple. Who is she? Maya chambered the next round, slowed her breathing to the pace she'd been taught in a unit whose name had been removed from her file, and settled in for the longest night of a life that had already had too many of them. Outside the wire, 91 men were beginning to understand that they had made a mistake. She was just beginning to show them how large it was. The second shot dropped a man at the base of the east wall, not the same position she'd fired from. She was already 40 meters south, moving along the interior of the perimeter in a low crouch, the HK slung across her chest and her handgun drawn for close work in case anyone had gotten inside the wire while she was repositioning. Nobody had. Not yet. The noisemaker on the east approach had bought her 90 seconds, and she'd used every one of them. She pressed her back against the HESCO barrier and listened. The desert does something to sound at night, flattens some frequencies, carries others with strange clarity across distances that should swallow them. She could hear voices from the eastern assault element, maybe 150 meters out, the cadence of men who were arguing about something. Not panicking, arguing. Which meant they still had discipline, which meant their leadership structure was intact despite the command element she'd dropped at 2,100 meters. Secondary leadership. She'd expected that. You didn't send 90-plus men against a target without redundancy in the chain of command. She needed to find the secondary, and she needed to do it before they reorganized. She moved to position 4, the northeast corner fighting position she'd spent 40 minutes improving with sandbags that afternoon, the one that covered the fold in terrain that the previous occupants had left as dead ground. She went prone, pulled the NVG monocular into place, and glassed the eastern approach. 47 men in a rough crescent 200 meters out, and in the center of the crescent, one man standing while the others crouched. Standing because he was reading a map or a tablet, too focused on the document in his hands to remember that standing made you the tallest thing in the field. People got comfortable when they thought the other side couldn't see them. She watched him for 8 seconds, calculating. The range was 190 meters, close enough that the shot was not difficult, far enough that the suppressed report would be directionally ambiguous to the men around him. She steadied the bipod on the sandbag lip, controlled her breathing, and thought about the problem for one more second. If she took this shot, they would know for certain there was a shooter on the northeast axis. They'd adjust their approach, and the next position she was counting on would be compromised. If she didn't take this shot, they'd reorganize in the next 4 minutes, and she'd lose the confusion window entirely. She took the shot. The man with the map went down. The crescent formation did exactly what she'd predicted. Half of them went flat, half of them broke left toward the lower ground, which was the instinctive movement and the wrong one because it brought them toward the wire approach she'd seeded with the noisemakers. She heard the first wire trigger within 30 seconds. The sound it made was not an explosion. It was a sharp mechanical crack followed by the rattle of the cans she'd attached to the wire. And in the dark, to a force that had just lost 2 leaders and couldn't localize the shooter, it sounded enough like the prelude to something worse that the entire east element went to ground and stopped moving. Maya was already repositioning again, said. She'd been at this for 2 hours and 11 minutes when her left leg started to give her real trouble. The knee had been a problem for years, the specific product of a fast rope insertion that had gone sideways in conditions she couldn't describe to anyone who didn't already have clearance to know they'd happened. The joint had been repaired surgically twice, and the surgical repairs had been declared successful by 2 different military physicians, and the military physicians had been correct in the technical sense that the joint functioned within normal parameters. What they hadn't been able to fix was the way it responded to cold and sustained physical stress, which was to accumulate a deep, aching stiffness that started as a nuisance and progressed over hours of movement into something that made certain positions genuinely difficult. She'd been moving continuously for 2 hours and 11 minutes in 40-degree Fahrenheit air. She dug a roll of athletic tape out of the med kit and wrapped the knee aggressively, pulling the joint into a position of slightly reduced mobility in exchange for better stability. It would make sprinting difficult. She wasn't planning to sprint. She was planning to make them believe she could be in 6 places at once, which required movement but not speed, and the tape would hold for what she needed. She went back to the TOC to check the radio. The emergency beacon was still transmitting. She swept through the tactical frequencies again and caught something. Not static this time, not the automated relay, but an actual human transmission, fragmented, the signal bouncing off something in the terrain that was both helping and degrading it. Ridge, say again your status, breaking up. Say again. She keyed the transmitter. This is Viper Ridge. I have approximately 90 personnel. Correction, estimate 87 at this time. Multiple points of entry. I am 1 personnel. I say again, solo defender. Request immediate. The transmission broke apart. She heard 2 words come back. Received and what might have been a unit designation she didn't recognize. If you copy this, South approach is the main effort. I've disrupted East element, but they are reorganizing. I need static. She held the transmitter for a moment. I need about 6 hours, she said, to the static, to whoever might be on the other end of nothing. Just keep the frequency open. She set the radio down and went back to work. Oh. At the 31-kilometer point on the main supply route, Captain Cross was on his 3rd argument of the night and losing all of them. He'd pulled his vehicle to the shoulder, which had earned him a sharp reprimand from the convoy commander, and he was standing outside in the cold with his handset pressed against his ear and the specific posture of a man who was trying very hard not to say the thing he actually wanted to say. Sir, the emergency signal has been continuous for over 2 hours. That means she's still transmitting, which means she's still... Captain. The voice on the other end was Colonel Marsh, who was the kind of officer who made decisions by determining which decision would create the least paperwork for himself. The UAV package has eyes on the grid. The assessment is that there's an active contact and 1 person responding to it. Sir. He paused. 1 person. We have assets redeploying. It takes time. How much time? Silence. The kind that wasn't a technical problem. Sir? How much time? Get back in your vehicle, Captain. Cross looked north up the road. In the direction of the mountains he couldn't see anymore in the dark. In the direction of a base he'd left 11 hours ago. And felt something shift in his chest. Not a decision exactly, more like the moment before a decision when you realize you've already made it and you're just catching up to yourself. I need a QRF. I need it now, and I need someone with authority to authorize it. You are not in a position to Colonel Marsh. He kept his voice flat, controlled. When this is over, however it ends, someone is going to be asked why they didn't send a quick reaction force when the emergency signal came through. I'd like that someone to have a better answer than we were assessing. The line was quiet for 4 seconds. I'll make contact with brigade. Thank you, sir. He got back in the vehicle. The sergeant driving looked straight ahead and said nothing, The way good NCOs did when an officer had just done something that might end his career and they decided to pretend they hadn't heard it. Cross pulled up the tactical map on his tablet and looked at the distance. 31 kilometers by road, less as the crow flew. The terrain between him and Viper Ridge was mountainous enough that air was the only practical fast option, and he had no helicopters. What he had was a vehicle, a road, and the math of how long it would take to drive 31 kilometers on a road that had not been maintained in 8 months. He did the math. He told the sergeant to turn around. Back at Viper Ridge, the South Assault element had found the claymores. Not by triggering them, by finding them, which was a different problem. Someone in the South element was experienced enough to move slowly and check the ground in front of them, and that experience had saved approximately 12 lives and also deprived Maya of the effect she'd been counting on. She watched through the optic as the South element leader, she could identify him by the way the others oriented toward him, held up a fist, and the entire formation froze. He was crouched over something at 20 meters from the south wall. He'd found the first claymore. She had to make a decision. She could take the shot on the South element leader from her current position. It was a 340-meter shot in deteriorating visibility. She was burning through the NVG battery, and the backup she'd found in the armory was not new. And it would confirm to the remaining force that the shooter was on the north axis. But taking him out now, before the South element breached, would set their timeline back. Or she could let them think they'd neutralized the South approach, let them move up, and trigger the second claymore manually at the moment it would do the most damage. She went with the second option because the second claymore's position was something she knew and they didn't, and knowledge was the only advantage she had in quantity. She moved south along the interior of the perimeter, keeping low, reaching the manual trigger position she'd designated that afternoon. The clicker was a standard M57 firing device, old but functional, the wire running out through a drainage gap in the base of the south wall. She'd run 60 meters of wire to keep herself out of the kill radius. She sat with the clicker in her left hand and the HK in her right and waited. The South element leader had apparently decided that 2 claymores was the extent of the trap and that neutralizing them was sufficient. She watched through a gap in the HESCO as he brought the element forward, moving in the careful but committed way of someone who believed the worst obstacle was behind them. 40 meters. 30. 25. She squeezed the clicker. The detonation was not the enormous explosion of action movies. A claymore produced a focused directional blast, a horizontal spray across a 60-degree arc, and at 25 meters, the effect on the personnel who caught the edge of it was immediate and severe. She heard the sounds she'd been trained to recognize as the aftermath of a claymore detonation, the specific quality of confusion and injury that was different from the sounds of a firefight. And then she was moving again because the muzzle flash from the claymore's detonation had briefly illuminated the area, and anyone watching would be looking hard at the south wall. She was back in the TOC in under 2 minutes, breathing hard, the knee throbbing badly now, the field dressing on her forehead soaked through and starting to drip into her right eye at intervals that were becoming distracting. She keyed the radio. Nothing. She took a 30-second count, 3 deep breaths, a methodical check of her ammunition. 7 magazines remaining from the original 12. She'd fired less than she'd expected because she'd been choosing shots carefully rather than firing for effect, and the noisemakers and claymores had done work that would otherwise have required rounds. But 7 magazines against a reconstituted force of, she was estimating 80 now, the 2 leadership contacts and the claymore's edge accounting for the reduction. 80 was still a number that required her to be very careful about every round she spent. She pulled the bloody field dressing off her forehead and replaced it. The cut was above her right eyebrow, not deep but positioned perfectly to bleed into her eye when she was prone, and her head was tilted forward on the rifle stock. She used a strip of the old dressing as a pressure bandage over the new one and secured it with a loop of medical tape that went around her head. She probably looked ridiculous. She wasn't going to think about how she looked. The radio crackled at 0112. Not static, not the automated relay. A voice, male, controlled, with the clipped cadence of someone who is reading from a communications protocol card. Viper Ridge, this is Condor 7. I copy your emergency beacon. Authenticate Whiskey Tango 4, over. An authentication code. An actual person on an actual radio following actual procedure, which meant this was a real contact and not a ghost signal. Her hands were steadier than she expected when she keyed the transmitter. Condor 7. Viper Ridge authenticates Lima 69er. I have active contact, approximately 80 personnel. I am one defender. Say again, single defender. I have casualties. Correction, no friendly casualties. Enemy casualties, estimate 15 to 20. I need a status on QRF. Over. A pause. She could hear the person on the other end processing the information, and in the pause she recognized the specific quality of someone doing math they weren't comfortable with. Viper Ridge, we copy single defender. QRF is being assembled. Say again your status. You have no casualties? Negative casualties. I have a head laceration and a bad knee. She said it the way you'd report a vehicle with a flat tire. The knee's been taped. The head's been dressed. I'm functional. I need to know how long before you can get eyes on this grid. Over. Another pause. Viper Ridge, earliest estimate is static cut across the transmission. 6 to 8 hours. 6 to 8 hours. She looked at her watch. It was 0112. 6 to 8 hours put first light at the earliest end and mid-morning at the latest. And mid-morning in this terrain, with a force that size, meant she needed to hold this position through the full night and well into daylight, which meant she needed to rethink everything she'd planned around darkness and NVG advantage. Copy 6 to 8 hours, she said. I'll need a resupply on 7.62 match ammunition, if that's possible. 7 mags remaining. Over. The silence on the other end was longer this time. Viper Ridge, we copy your request. Stand by. She set the handset down and went to the roof. The east element had reorganized. She could see it in the way they were moving now, except different from before, tighter, more deliberate. The loose crescent formation replaced with something more disciplined. They'd gone to a bounding overwatch pattern, 2-man teams moving while the others covered, which told her 2 things. They had someone with real tactical knowledge in command now, and they were no longer operating under the assumption that the base was lightly defended. They were operating under the assumption that the base was defended by someone who knew what they were doing. That was a problem, because a force that respected the threat adapted to it, and a force that adapted to it was harder to manipulate with the kind of tricks she'd been using. She watched the bounding overwatch for 4 minutes, tracking the pattern, finding the interval. Every tactical pattern had an interval, a moment in the rotation when the covering element shifted their focus from one sector to another, a fraction of a second when the protection was at its lowest. It was barely exploitable by a single shooter, but barely was better than nothing. She found the interval at the 11-second mark in the rotation. She built her shot timing around the 11-second mark. She fired twice in a 20-minute window, both shots during the interval, and both times she was moving before the echo finished carrying. The east element's advance stopped both times. She didn't know if she'd hit anyone. At this range and in this visibility, she was shooting at shapes and movement signatures rather than clearly defined targets, and she was prioritizing suppression over accuracy. What she was actually shooting was time. Every minute she kept them outside the wire was a minute closer to something that might be coming. Every hesitation she forced cost them initiative. Every time they adapted, she had to adapt faster. And she was 1 person against 80, which meant the only real resource she had was the speed at which she could think. She was burning through that resource too. She could feel it. Not the sharp exhaustion of maximum physical effort, but the duller, more dangerous drain of sustained cognitive work in a high-stress environment without rest. She was making more decisions per minute than her brain was designed to sustain indefinitely. She went back to the TOC, drank half a bottle of water, ate 2 protein bars she'd found in her kit that she'd forgotten were there, and gave herself 5 minutes to sit completely still and do nothing except let her nervous system stabilize. The radio crackled. Condor 7 again. Viper Ridge, I have an update for you. Go ahead. QRF has been authorized. Captain Cross, I'm told you know him, has requested to lead the element. They're staging now. Road estimate is 2 to 2.5 hours from current position. Cross. She closed her eyes for a second, not from relief exactly, more from the specific sensation of learning that someone had done the right thing when you'd half expected they wouldn't. Copy that, 2 hours. She opened her eyes. Tell him to come in from the north. South approach has a triggered claymore on the road at approximately 60 meters from the gate. East approach has wire obstacles at 20 meters. Tell him the gate code was changed when the base was configured. It's now 44771. He'll need it. She paused. And tell him I'm on the roof of the TOC. Tell him not to shoot at the roof of the TOC. We'll pass that along, Viper Ridge. She almost said something else. Something about how she'd tried the emergency frequency for an hour before anyone answered. Something about the 2 hours she'd spent alone before the first real contact. She didn't say it. It wouldn't help anything. Viper Ridge out. Yeah. It was 0200 when they got on the radio. Not Condor 7. A different voice, lower, more deliberate, with an accent she placed roughly as Central Asian, and a quality of formality that suggested the speaker was educated and had prepared what they were going to say. The transmission came through on the emergency channel, which meant they'd found her frequency, which meant they'd either had it from intelligence beforehand or they'd been scanning and picked up her traffic. Viper Ridge, like her own call sign in a stranger's mouth. I know you are there. I know you are alone. A pause. Your own command abandoned you. You know this. Why do you continue to fight for people who left you to die? She listened to the whole thing before she keyed the transmitter. She almost didn't answer. There was a tactical argument for not answering. Radio engagement was time and attention she didn't have to spare, and it told them she was listening, which told them things about her state. But she thought about it for 3 seconds and decided that whoever was talking to her on that radio was also one of the people directing the assault. And a person who was talking to her was a person who was not thinking exclusively about the best way to breach her perimeter. She keyed the transmitter. Because you don't understand what you're standing on, she said. A silence on the other end that she found satisfying in a way she couldn't completely explain. What does that mean? The voice finally said. It means this is going to cost you more than you planned for. She paused. You had good intelligence on this base. But your intelligence was about what this base is now, not what it used to be, not who used to come through here. She let that sit. You should look at the base records. The ones from before it was reclassified as a logistics facility. Look at who was assigned here before I was. She released the transmitter and went back to the rifle. She didn't actually know if the base records contained anything relevant. She was operating on instinct, on the knowledge that the locker in the armory had existed for a reason, and that the equipment in it was not the equipment of a logistics coordinator. She was threading a needle, giving them enough to make them uncertain without giving them anything actionable. Whether it worked depended on how much time they spent trying to verify it. She was about to find out. The voice came back 11 minutes later. It was different now. The deliberate formality was still there, but underneath it was something tighter. Not quite fear, but the cousin of fear that lived in the specific territory of finding out you might have misunderstood a situation. Who are you? She was in the middle of repositioning, moving from the south interior to the west wall for a pattern she'd been planning for the last 40 minutes. She stopped, pressed against the HESCO, and keyed her handset with her thumb. The wrong person to leave behind, she said. She released the button and kept moving. Behind her, in the dark outside the wire, she could hear the east element had stopped advancing again. She didn't know if it was because of the radio exchange or because of the tactical hesitation she'd been building through the night, and she didn't have time to analyze it. She moved to the west wall position and went prone and glassed the western slope. Clear. She moved back to the north wall and glassed there. The north slope, which had been clear for the last hour, now had movement on it. Not a large element. 4 or 5 figures moving slowly and carefully in a wide arc. She tracked them for 30 seconds and understood what she was seeing. A flanking attempt, deliberately slow, deliberately quiet, coming around the north slope while the east and south elements held her attention. Textbook, a commander who was adapting in real time. She tracked the flanking element and did the math. They were 20 minutes from the north wall at their current pace, maybe 15 if they committed to speed once they got close enough that caution mattered less. The north wall was her weakest point. She'd reinforced the fighting position but hadn't had time to emplace any obstacles, and 4 or 5 disciplined fighters coming over the north wall simultaneously was a problem she couldn't solve from a single position. She had 15 minutes. She went to the maintenance shed. What she was looking for was not elegant. It was not precise. It was 40 meters of concertina wire she'd seen coiled on a rack when she'd swept the shed that afternoon, and 4 T-posts, and a post driver that was essentially a weighted steel tube that you slid over a T-post and dropped repeatedly until the post was in the ground. She drove 4 posts in the dark by feel and memory, marking the positions she'd identified that afternoon, and strung the concertina in a single strand at knee height across the most likely approach to the north wall. It took 9 minutes. She hit her hand on the wire twice, and the second time it opened a cut across the back of her left hand that she didn't have time to address. So she wrapped it in a loop of tape from her kit while she was walking back to the north wall position. She was back at the fighting position in 11 minutes. The flanking element was still 8 minutes out. She had 3 minutes. She used them to think. There was a pattern emerging in the way the assault force was operating, and the pattern told her something about what was coming next. The commander on that radio had shifted from an overconfident rapid breach to something more deliberate and more dangerous. They were accepting higher time cost in exchange for lower casualty risk, which meant they were confident they could hold their position until something changed in their favor. What was going to change in their favor was daylight. When the sun came up, her NVG advantage disappeared. When her NVG advantage disappeared, the numbers advantage they had was going to matter more. She had somewhere between 4 and 5 hours before first light, and Cross was 2 hours out, which meant she had a window of approximately 2 hours at minimum and 4 hours at maximum during which the force pressure was going to increase and her capacity to resist it was going to decrease. She'd been bleeding, her forehead, now her hand, and she'd been moving for almost 3 hours, and the knee tape was holding, but the joint itself was telling her things she didn't want to hear. She could hold 2 hours. The math on 4 hours was less comfortable. She settled into the fighting position and watched the flanking element work their way toward the concertina wire and thought about how, 31 kilometers south of here, someone had written her name off a manifest and made a decision that they probably felt fine about. She thought about that for exactly 1 second. Then she pushed it away and got back on the rifle, because sentiment was a thing that had a time and a place, and this was neither. The first figure in the flanking element hit the concertina wire at ankle height in the dark and went down hard, and the sound of it carried clearly over the desert silence, and Maya exhaled slowly through her nose and adjusted her point of aim. She was still here. She intended to keep being here. The man who hit the concertina wire went down on his side and didn't get up quietly. He made the sound men made when wire found them in the dark. A sharp intake of breath, then a low, sustained noise that wasn't quite a word, the wire holding him at the ankle, and the more he moved, the more it bit. Maya heard his teammates stop. She heard the difference between the sound of men moving and the sound of men frozen, reassessing, looking at the dark in front of them, and doing math they didn't like the answer to. She did not fire. She let the wire do the work, let them spend 2 minutes extracting their man from it, 2 minutes in which they were stationary and loud and entirely focused on the immediate problem of the concertina, rather than on what was waiting for them on the other side of the north wall. 2 minutes was not nothing. 2 minutes was 2 minutes closer to Cross, and whatever he was bringing up that road. She counted. When they moved again, they moved differently. Slower, lower, sweeping their feet in front of them before committing weight, the way men moved when they'd learned the ground wasn't safe. It would cost them another 4 minutes to reach the wall. She had 6 minutes before they got close enough to be a problem she couldn't manage with wire and patience. She used 3 of those minutes to move to the second north wall position she'd identified that afternoon. Not the corner fighting post, but a spot 30 meters east of it, a gap between 2 HESCO sections where the barrier had settled slightly and left a low spot she could shoot over without exposing her silhouette. She went prone in the gravel and waited. The flanking element arrived at the wall in 4 figures, not 5. Somewhere in the wire extraction, one of them had decided this was not worth continuing or had been hurt badly enough to need help getting back, and she filed that information without reacting to it. 4. They came to the wall in a stack, 2 men low, 2 standing, standard over-under breach preparation. She watched them through the NVG monocular and waited until the first man's hands reached the top of the HESCO. She fired once. The man at the top of the HESCO dropped back. The stack compressed in the specific way of people who have just experienced incoming fire from a direction they weren't expecting, and she was already moving laterally, changing her angle, because the muzzle flash from her position would be visible in NVG and they would look for it. She moved 10 meters east and went flat. They didn't breach. They pulled back. Not a rout, a withdrawal, disciplined enough that she could hear the whispered cadence of it, a leader controlling the movement back into the dead ground north of the wall. She tracked them until they were beyond her NVG range and then held position for 90 seconds, listening. The desert gave her nothing back. She took the 90 seconds to check her watch and do the account ending. It was 0224. Cross was somewhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours out. She had 7 magazines and she'd fired 3 rounds in the last 20 minutes, which was good. She was being careful. She was making them count. But 7 magazines against a reconstituted force of roughly 75 was a number she kept coming back to the way you keep pressing a bruise. She needed to stop spending rounds on things she could spend something else on. She went back to thinking. The voice on the radio found her at 0251. She was in the TOC, sitting on the floor with her back against the radio console, eating the last protein bar and trying to give her knee 5 minutes of horizontal rest. The knee didn't feel better for the rest, but it didn't feel worse either, which she was choosing to categorize as a win. The transmission was not on the emergency channel. It was on a frequency she recognized, a tactical frequency that had been in use by Viper Ridge during its operational period, which meant they had access to the old communications architecture, which meant their intelligence on this base was better than she'd been giving them credit for. Sergeant Callahan. Her name, her actual name, not a call sign, not a generic address. She picked up the handset slowly. "You've been busy?" the voice said. Same man as before. The educated formality, the careful pronunciation. He was closer now. The transmission quality was better, which meant the radio was closer, which meant he'd moved his command element in while she'd been managing the flanking attempt. She didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about the fact that he'd used her name and what that meant about what he'd found. "You looked at the records," she said. "We looked at the records." A pause. "There is a gap. 2009 to 2014. Your service file shows you were stationed at 3 different bases during that period. But the bases have no record of you. The assignments exist on paper. The work does not. Paperwork gets lost. 5 years of paperwork." Another pause. "We also found a citation, unattributed, filed under a classified operations code that we cannot fully access. But the date we can read. And the location description, even redacted, tells us something." She said nothing. "You were at Karim Pass," he said. "In 2012. She looked at the wall of the TOC, at the bare concrete where someone had taped a standard-issue desert operations map that had been taken down during the evacuation, leaving behind a rectangle of slightly cleaner concrete in the shape of what used to be there. Karim Pass. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. 7 operators went in, the voice said. The mission was to extract an asset. The operation was compromised. 5 of the 7 were killed in the first hour. He was reading now. She could hear the quality of it, the slight formality of someone reciting rather than recalling. The 2 survivors extracted the asset and reached the secondary exfil point after 31 hours in hostile territory. The asset was recovered. The mission was categorized as a failure because of the casualties. A longer pause. Except the asset was never supposed to be recovered. The asset was meant to disappear with the mission. She kept her face neutral by habit, even though she was alone. "You're very well informed," she said. "We have been trying to locate Karim Pass survivors for 4 years," he said. "We did not expect to find one defending a logistics base issue in the middle of nowhere. So now you know." "Now I know." His voice shifted slightly, something that wasn't quite respect but was in the neighborhood of it. "Sergeant Callahan, you are wounded. You are alone. You have been fighting for 3 hours against a force that outnumbers you 20-1, your own command 75-1, she said. "If your count was 92 to start, a beat. Outnumbers you 75-1, your command abandoned you. They will not come in time." His voice settled into something that was almost gentle, which was worse than if it had been aggressive. You have proven something tonight. You have proven it completely. There is no shame in— Stop. She said it quietly, not angry, just a full stop. I hear what you're doing. I understand it. And I need you to understand that it's not going to work. Not because I have something to prove. Not because I'm not tired, because I am. I'm extremely tired. But because the second I open that gate, I stop being a problem. You have to manage, and I start being a problem you have already solved, and I've been a problem that gets solved before. I don't care for it. Silence. Get your men off my perimeter, she said. Go home. She set the handset down. She sat for 30 seconds in the quiet of the TOC, breathing slowly, and then she pushed herself upright and went back to work. What she hadn't told the voice on the radio was that she was hurt worse than she'd let on. The forehead cut was manageable. The hand was manageable. The knee was painful but functional. What was not manageable, or was becoming less manageable with each passing hour, was the exit wound on her left side. She'd taken a fragment hit sometime during the Claymore detonation. She hadn't registered it at the time because the adrenaline of the moment had buried the sensation, and she'd been moving immediately after, and moving had kept the adrenaline high, and by the time the adrenaline came down enough to let the pain surface, she'd been too busy to do anything about it. She'd thought it was a bruise from the HESCO. She'd thought it was the edge of her plate carrier digging in from the sustained prone position. She'd been wrong. The fragment had caught her at the left lateral margin of her plate carrier, the gap between the side plate and the main plate, the place armor didn't quite cover, the place everyone hoped would be good enough. It was a small fragment, probably, because the wound channel was not large and she was still functional, but it had gone in and it had not come out, and she'd been bleeding internally for an unknown period at an unknown rate. She discovered this when she stopped to replace the forehead dressing and happened to put her hand against her left side and felt the wet. She lifted her shirt. The entry point was about the size of a pencil eraser, just forward of her left floating rib. No exit wound. The skin around it was darkening in a way that concerned her more than the wound itself. She did the assessment the way she'd been trained to do it, clinical, sequential, without the running commentary of panic that her body was trying to generate somewhere below the level of conscious thought. The bleeding was present but not arterial. The color was dark. The flow was seeping rather than pulsing. The location suggested the fragment had not hit the liver, which would have been a rapid bleed-out problem. It might have hit a lower rib, might have penetrated into the lower lung field, might have done something to her lower GI that she wouldn't know about until it became a serious infection problem in 12 to 24 hours. For the next 2 hours, in terms of what she could do tonight, she was functional. She packed the wound with the hemostatic gauze from her kit, pressing it in with the first 2 fingers of her right hand and holding pressure for 3 minutes by her watch, which was 3 minutes she could not spend on anything else. She taped it over with a pressure dressing and lowered her shirt and put her plate carrier back on. She did not tell Condor 7. She would tell them when Cross arrived because Cross was coming and she needed to get there, and if she told them now, they would begin adjusting their timeline around her medical status, and she didn't want her medical status to be a factor in anyone's decision-making until she'd made it unnecessary. She added the wound to the list of things she was not thinking about and went to the east wall. The east assault element had done something she hadn't predicted. In the 90 minutes since she'd last actively engaged them, they'd moved laterally, not toward the base but along the ridgeline to the east, extending their arc northward until they were positioned along the ridge that ran parallel to the east wall rather than perpendicular to it. From that position, they had a line of sight into the base interior that they hadn't had before. She understood what they were setting up. Firing positions, elevated. They were going to suppress from the ridgeline while the south element breached, using the height advantage to reach positions inside the perimeter that her HESCO barriers couldn't protect. It was a good plan. It was the right plan, given that everything else they'd tried had been stopped by barriers and obstacles, and a single shooter who kept not being where they expected her. She had maybe 20 minutes before they were ready. She ran the problem. She had 7 magazines. She had 1 functioning Claymore location. The first one they'd found and bypassed was still armed because they'd discovered it without triggering it, which meant it was still viable if she could get to the initiator. She had concertina wire on the north approach. She had noisemakers on 2 remaining approaches that hadn't been used yet. What she didn't have was a way to suppress an elevated ridgeline position and simultaneously prevent a south wall breach. One person could not do both, so she wasn't going to try to do both. She was going to let them think the south wall was the problem. She went to the south wall, and she made noise. Deliberate, controlled noise. Movement along the interior of the south perimeter that was visible and audible to anyone watching from outside. She fired 2 shots through a gap in the HESCO in the general direction of the south tree line. Not at anything specific, just enough to confirm that there was a shooter on the south wall who was paying attention to the south approach. Then she went up. The roof of the main barracks building, not the TOC, the barracks, which was 10 meters east of it and slightly lower, gave her an angle on the eastern ridgeline that the ground positions didn't have. She'd been avoiding the rooftops because elevated positions were exposed and she'd needed to stay mobile. But mobility was a resource and she was changing how she was spending it. She went up the exterior ladder in the dark, the left side protesting each rung with a specific and personal complaint that she ignored, and got flat on the roof with the HK. The ridgeline was 340 meters. She could see the shapes of the firing positions they were establishing. Small, careful, men who were taking their time because they believed she was occupied with the south wall. She worked from right to left, 1 shot every 45 seconds, moving her point of aim 2 meters between shots so that each successive shot came from a slightly different apparent direction. At 340 meters in the dark, accuracy against a prepared position was not reliable, and she wasn't expecting to neutralize the ridgeline. She was expecting to make the men on the ridgeline keep their heads down and their attention on the roof of a building rather than on the south wall. She fired 6 rounds. Then she heard it. The radio. Not the handset she'd been carrying, but the TOC radio, which she'd left transmitting on the emergency channel. The volume was low, but the TOC was adjacent to the barracks, and in the silence of the desert, the transmission carried. A voice she recognized. Cross. Viper Ridge, this is Bandit 6. I am approximately 40 minutes from your position, coming in from the north. Can you confirm the gate code and your status? Over. 40 minutes. She got off the roof faster than her body wanted her to. She told him the gate code. She told him her position. She told him the obstacle locations. North Concertina, South Claymore. The wire on the east approach she'd strung on her second circuit of the perimeter 3 hours ago that she hadn't even mentioned to Condor 7 because she'd been doing too many things at once to track what she'd reported and what she hadn't. What's your status? Cross asked. His voice had the quality of someone who had been driving fast for 2 hours on a bad road and was working hard to sound calm. Functional, she said. A pause that meant he heard something in that word she hadn't intended to put there. Maya. He'd never used her first name before. In 6 months at Viper Ridge, it had always been Callahan, always the last name, the professional distance. What's your actual status? She looked at the left side of her shirt, at the dressing she'd put there that she couldn't see clearly, in the dark but could feel. I have a fragment wound, left lateral torso, packed and dressed, non-arterial. I've been functional for 4 hours since discovery. She paused. I need a medic when you get here. Not immediately. When you get here. The silence on the other end was longer than a communications pause. We have a medic, he said. Copy your status. 40 minutes. Copy. When you hit the north approach, your headlights are going to be visible to the east ridgeline element before you get to the gate. Kill your lights at the base of the north slope and run dark for the last, she calculated, 600 meters. I'll key my radio 3 times when I hear your engine. You key back once when you have the gate in sight. Understood. Another pause. How many are still out there? Estimate 65 to 70. The ridgeline element is the priority. They're trying to establish overwatch on the interior. South element is reorganizing. The flanking group off the north went cold about an hour ago. I don't know if they pulled back or repositioned. 65 to 70. Approximately. Against 1. Until 40 minutes from now, she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. I had to fight for the QRF authorization, he said. I want you to know that. I know. Graves. I know, she said again. Quieter. We can talk about Graves when there's time. Right now I need you to drive. Driving, he said. She clicked off and went back to the east wall. The voice found her one more time. It was 0340, 20 minutes before Cross's estimated arrival, and the ridgeline element had gone quiet in a way that concerned her. Not withdrawn, she could still see the positions, but holding. Waiting. The south element had pushed up to 30 meters from the south wall and was holding there too, in a posture that read like pre-breach staging. They were synchronizing. She was moving between the south wall and the east-facing barracks position, trying to be visible in enough places that they couldn't confirm she'd committed to one sector when the radio crackled. Sergeant Callahan. Same voice, different tone. Whatever the educated formality had been covering before was closer to the surface now, something that had been reassessed. We found the full file. She stopped moving. The redacted portions. We have people who know how to read redactions. A pause. Kareem Pass. 7 personnel entered. 5 were killed in the first engagement. The 2 survivors, you and an individual listed only by a code name, spent 31 hours extracting the asset through territory that our own records describe as completely denied. On day 3, the code-named individual was wounded. You completed the extraction alone. She said nothing. The asset was a scientist, the voice continued. Biological program. Someone in your command structure wanted him to disappear. You brought him out anyway. Another pause. The mission was recorded as a failure. The scientist was recorded as deceased. You were transferred to logistics. She was still not speaking. They didn't transfer you because you failed, the voice said. They transferred you because you succeeded when they needed you not to. The desert was very quiet. You've been punished, he said, for doing the right thing, and now the same command structure has left you here to die. He let that land. I'm offering you a third option. She found her voice. You should listen carefully, she said, because I'm going to say this once. She was aware of the flat quality in her own voice, the one that came not from control, but from something past the point where control was necessary. I know what I did. I know what it cost me. I know exactly what kind of people are sitting in offices right now deciding whether or not my signal is worth responding to. She paused. And I am still here. I'm not still here because I'm loyal to them. I'm still here because if I open that gate, the next person who comes up that road gets hurt. The person after that gets hurt. This is a road that people I don't know use, and they deserve to use it without your organization controlling what's on the other end of it. Another pause. That's it. That's the whole reason. It's not complicated. Silence. You're going to lose people tonight, she said. More than you already have. That's not a threat, it's just math. I'd rather you didn't. Go home. She released the transmitter. 30 seconds later, the south element moved. They came fast. Not the careful bounding approach she'd been managing all night, but a committed rush, men on their feet and moving hard. The kind of assault that accepted casualties in exchange for speed and momentum. She heard them hit the 30-meter line, then 20, and the ridgeline element opened up simultaneously. Suppressive fire into the base interior, rounds snapping overhead as she went flat behind the HESCO. She low-crawled to the Claymore initiator position, the first one they'd found and bypassed, the one that was still armed and that they hadn't rechecked because they'd already cleared it once, the most dangerous assumption in fieldcraft, and got the clicker in her right hand. The south element hit the wall. She gave it 4 seconds, enough for the commitment to be complete, enough for the maximum concentration of personnel in the kill zone, and she squeezed the clicker. Nothing. She squeezed again. Nothing. The wire. Either the extraction of the found Claymore had damaged the initiator wire, or the concussion from the first detonation earlier in the night had done something to the connection. She was blind firing an initiator with no feedback and no time to check the wire. The first man came over the south wall. She rolled left, came up on one knee, and shot him off the top of the barrier at a range of 12 meters. The shot was not clean. It was fast and close and the angle was awkward. But it was enough. A second man was already coming over and she was moving, the knee screaming at her, getting lateral, getting the barrier between herself and the ridgeline fire. 2 men over the wall. Then 3. She was in CQB range now. This was no longer a designated marksman problem. This was a close quarters problem, and the HK at 7.62 was not the ideal tool for a 3-meter engagement. She transitioned to the handgun without thinking about it, the muscle memory of 100 training sessions taking over where conscious decision was too slow. She cleared the first interior angle, took the second man with 2 rounds center mass at 8 meters, and heard the third hit the ground behind her and start moving. She turned. The third man was down, not from her, from something that had come over the south wall after him. Cross's people were at the south wall. She heard Cross before she saw him, his voice cutting across the radio, sharp, clipped, the voice of a man coordinating a breach. Bandit elements, I have a single friendly inside the perimeter, south quadrant. Do not fire south. I say again, do not fire south. Acknowledge. She found cover behind a vehicle frame that had been left in the south interior and keyed her radio. Callahan, south interior, I'm behind the deuce frame. I see you, Keith, Cross said. Stay down. She stayed down. The next 6 minutes were the longest 6 minutes of the night, not because she was in the most danger, but because she wasn't doing anything, because the situation had moved past the point where she was the primary variable, and she had to trust that what was coming through the gate was competent and oriented. She used the 6 minutes to press her hand against her left side and assess the dressing. The dressing was soaked. She replaced it with the last piece of hemostatic gauze in her kit and held pressure and sat with her back against the wheel of the deuce and listened to the firefight sort itself out across the base interior and exterior. It was loud for 4 minutes. Then it was less loud. Then it was the sound of men calling out positions and confirmations, the specific cadence of a clearing operation moving from building to building, and she recognized the sound as the transition from active contact to aftermath and let her head fall back against the tire. Cross found her 3 minutes later. He came around the front of the vehicle with a flashlight held low, moving carefully, and when the beam found her, his face did something she was too tired to interpret. Medic, he said, not to her, over his shoulder, then to her. Talk to me. I'm here, she said. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. He was dusty, and his uniform was disheveled from what had clearly been a fast drive over bad road, and his face had the look of someone who'd been running math for 2 hours on a problem with no good answers. Left side, she said. Fragment. I packed it, but it's been about an hour and a half. Okay. He was already moving her hand away from the dressing, looking, his face doing the thing faces did when the information coming in was worse than what you'd prepared for. Okay, we've got you. The medic arrived, young, fast, professional, already cutting the fabric away from the wound with a pair of trauma shears, his hands moving in the practiced way of someone who had done this before. She looked past Cross at the south wall, at the gate that was now open, at the shapes of soldiers moving through the base in the gray beginning of pre-dawn light. The ridgeline to the east was quiet. The south approach was quiet. The base was not quiet in the way that an empty base was quiet. It was quiet in the aftermath way. The sound of something that had been happening, not happening anymore. The specific silence of a fight that had ended. Cross crouched in front of her so that his face was level with hers. We're going to get you out, he said. She looked at him. This base, she said, the records, the pre-logistics records. There's a locker in the armory. Make sure someone pulls the records from it before anyone has a chance to disappear them. He stared at her. The medic was working, and she could feel the pressure of it, the specific sensation of trained hands at her left side, and she kept her eyes on Cross. Records, she said again. Because it mattered. Because it was why she was here and why she was still here, and why 70-plus men had spent an entire night trying to take this particular piece of ground from one particular person who was supposed to be easy to leave behind. I'll handle it, Cross said. Stop talking. She let her head fall back against the tire again and watched the sky above Viper Ridge go from black to the gray-purple that came before dawn, the stars fading at the edges of her vision in the way that might have been the sky lightening and might have been something else. The medic said something to Cross that she didn't fully process. Cross said something back. She closed her eyes for what she told herself would be 30 seconds. The thing about a fight ending was that the body kept the bill and presented it at the moment the fight stopped. And the bill for this particular night was substantial. She'd known it was coming, had felt it accumulating in the dark margins of the last 4 hours. And she'd been managing it the way you managed a debt you couldn't pay yet, keeping it at arm's length through motion and necessity. Necessity had stopped. The bill arrived. She let it come, because there was nothing left to do but let it come. And somewhere above her, the dawn was starting, and the East Ridge line was quiet, and the people she'd been keeping off that road were still able to use it. That was enough. For right now, in this moment, with the medic's hands at her side and Cross's voice somewhere above her, and the first pale light of morning touching the top of the HESCO barriers, it was enough. She was conscious for the medevac. That was the part she'd remember later. Not the pain, which was considerable, but the specific quality of being awake while people moved around her, above her, their faces catching the early light, their voices clipped and professional in the way of people who were working hard enough that they didn't have attention left for anything else. The medic, she never got his name, would spend weeks afterward trying to find it, had gotten an IV in her right arm before she'd finished processing that he was trying, and he'd said things to Cross in the abbreviated shorthand of trauma assessment that she'd been trained to understand and understood now in a detached way, like hearing someone describe a car she used to drive. Fragment, likely lower rib contact, possible pulmonary margin, stable but needs imaging, she needs to go now. Cross had said, "Then let's go." The helicopter came in from the east, which was the direction the ridgeline had come from, which she found darkly funny in a way she didn't have the energy to articulate. She watched the rotor wash move through the pre-dawn light and thought about the fact that 4 hours ago, that ridgeline had been full of people trying to kill her, and now there was a medevac bird using it as a reference point, and the desert didn't care about either of those things. The desert just sat there being the desert, indifferent in the specific way of terrain that had seen everything. Cross rode with her. She didn't ask him to. He just got in. For the first 20 minutes of the flight, she drifted in and out. Not unconscious exactly, more like the volume on everything kept turning down and then back up. And each time it came back up, she was slightly more surprised to still be there. Cross sat across from her in the fold-down seat, and he wasn't talking, wasn't on his radio, wasn't doing the things officers did when they had a spare moment. He was just sitting there watching her with the expression of someone who was doing math and not sharing the result. At some point, she said, "The locker." "I handled it," he said. "I put 2 of my people on it before we lifted. Nobody's touching it." She nodded, and the volume turned back down. Chug. The field hospital was at FOB Kestrel, 60 kilometers south. She was in surgery for 2 hours. The fragment had cracked her 8th rib and lodged against the pleural margin without penetrating it, which the surgeon described as extremely fortunate in a tone that made it clear he was using the word carefully. They removed the fragment, addressed the bleeding, installed a chest drain to manage what had been a slow accumulation of fluid in the pleural space, and transferred her to recovery with the kind of efficiency that came from a facility that had practiced this exact sequence too many times. She woke in recovery at 0940 to find Cross in a chair beside her bed, reading something on a tablet with the concentration of someone who was trying very hard to look like he wasn't waiting. "The locker," she said, because it was the last thing she remembered saying, and it seemed like a reasonable place to resume. He looked up, set the tablet down. "The locker has been secured by my people. The contents have been photographed and documented. I have copies." He paused. "I also pulled the base communication logs from the last 72 hours, the recordings of the emergency channel, the authentication codes, the timeline of when your signal went out, and when responses came in." Another pause, weighted differently. "Or didn't come in." She looked at the ceiling. There was a water stain on one of the tiles in the shape of nothing in particular, and she studied it the way you studied things when you were processing information that required more room than the immediate moment provided. "How long until Graves finds out what you pulled?" she asked. "He probably already knows." "And?" Cross shifted in his chair. And he's filed a request to have me reassigned pending a review of my conduct during the evacuation." He said it without inflection, the way you'd report a weather event, which tells me he's more worried than he's letting on. She turned her head to look at him. He looked like he hadn't slept, which he hadn't, and there was a cut on his jaw from something that had happened during the breach that he'd closed with a butterfly bandage that was slightly crooked. "You went to bat for me," she said. "I tried." He didn't make it into more than it was. "I lost." Then you turned around and drove back anyway. He didn't answer immediately. There was a communication log, he said finally. Your emergency beacon went active at 1847. The first human response came at 0112. He did the math she'd already done. Over 5 hours. You were alone up there for 5 hours and 25 minutes before anyone acknowledged your signal, and the acknowledgement was from a relay station that couldn't do anything for you for another 2 hours. He stopped. I kept running that number in my head the whole drive back. 5 hours. I had work to do, she said. It went fast. It came out dry enough that Cross let out a short sound that was almost a laugh, and immediately wasn't. The records from the locker, he said, redirecting. I looked at them. She waited. The equipment registration goes back to a unit designation that I had to look up because I'd never heard of it. When I looked it up, there was a security flag on the search. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize within 4 minutes of running that search. He looked at her steadily. Someone is watching that designation. Yes, she said, they would be. Who are they? She looked back at the ceiling, at the water stain. People who made a decision in 2012 that I was a loose end, she said, and then made a second decision that the easiest way to manage a loose end was to make it invisible. Put it somewhere quiet, give it a title that doesn't matter, and a base that nobody cares about. She paused. It worked for 11 years, until someone decided to attack the base you were on. Until that, she agreed. The chest drain shifted when she breathed in a way that was not painful exactly, but was persistently present, a reminder of interior architecture she didn't usually think about. She breathed through it. Kareem Pass, Cross said. She'd known it was coming. She'd known it was coming since the voice on the radio had said it in the dark, and she'd filed it under things to deal with when I'm not being shot at, and now she was not being shot at. What do you know? She asked. Only what I could pull in the last few hours, which isn't much. The operation code is still classified. Most of the personnel records are redacted to the point of uselessness. But there's a citation, unattributed, filed under the operation code, that lists an action date and a grid that puts it in the Kareem Valley in April 2012. He looked at her carefully. And there's a casualty report. 5 names, all redacted, but 5. She was quiet for a moment. Their names were Reyes, Holloway, Park, Fitzpatrick, and Dumont, she said. Reyes was the team leader. He was 34. He had a daughter he called Bean because she was so small when she was born, and she'd probably be about 16 now. She said it without visible emotion, which was not the same as feeling nothing. Holloway was 29. He was the best shot I've ever seen, and he would have hated knowing I said that because he thought compliments made people lazy. Cross didn't move. We went in to extract an asset, she continued. Scientist, biological program, weapons application. He'd made contact through a back channel asking to come out, and the operation was put together in 72 hours, which was, in retrospect, not enough time to vet the intelligence. She paused. The insertion site was compromised. We don't know how. The team leader's best assessment in the moment was that there was a leak at the planning level, which meant someone in the command structure above us had either provided the insertion coordinates to the opposition or had allowed them to be obtained. Someone wanted the operation to fail. Someone wanted the asset to disappear, she corrected. The operation failing was a side effect. 5 people dying was a side effect. She said it flat, and the flatness was not a lack of feeling. It was 11 years of feeling compressed into something load-bearing. Reyes was killed in the first 10 minutes. I took command. We lost 3 more in the next 6 hours. Me and a man named Garrett, the code name in the file. We got the scientist to the secondary exfil with 14 hours to go before the pickup window. And Garrett? Took around on day 2. I carried him the last 4 kilometers. She paused. He made it. Last I heard, he was doing physical therapy in Maryland. We don't communicate. It's easier. Cross was very still. The scientist, he said. What happened to him? He's alive, she said. Somewhere, under a different name. The information he brought out was significant enough that the people who wanted him dead could not simply make him dead once he was in custody. Too many people knew he existed by that point, so they did the next best thing. She looked at Cross. They buried the operation. classified everything, recorded the scientist as deceased in the public record, and then they looked at the two people who'd actually completed the mission and decided that the simplest solution to the problem of witnesses was reassignment. You were punished for succeeding. I was managed, she said. There's a difference. Being punished implies the people doing it felt something about it. This was purely administrative. She could see Cross processing this, the specific quality of a person reorganizing what they thought they knew into a shape that accommodated new information. The people watching that unit designation, he said slowly. When I ran the search, were almost certainly people connected to the same command structure, she said, who have spent 11 years watching to make sure nothing surfaced. She paused, and who now know that a lot of things surfaced last night. Cross stood up from the chair. He went to the window. The room had a small window that looked out over the FOB's interior, a view of vehicle lanes and temporary structures and the general organized chaos of a forward base, and stood there with his hands in his pockets. So what happens now, he said. To the window? Now, she said, someone is going to come here and try to make this go away. And they sent Colonel Marsh. She'd been expecting Graves, which told her something about how seriously they were taking it. Graves was the person who made local problems go away, and Marsh was the person they sent when local wasn't the right frame anymore. Marsh was the kind of officer who wore his rank the way some men wore expensive watches, prominently, deliberately, as a first line of communication. He arrived at 14:30, 18 hours after the last shots at Viper Ridge, and he came with a JAG officer and an aide who carried a briefcase and didn't speak. Cross had been in and out all morning, coordinating the after-action documentation, and when Marsh's vehicle pulled up, Cross was there, which Maya was reasonably certain Marsh had not expected and was not pleased by. They came into her room in a group. Marsh took the one chair. The JAG officer, a major named Delray, trim and careful, stood at the foot of the bed. The aide stayed near the door with the briefcase. Cross stood against the wall near the window with his arms folded and the deliberate stillness of a person who intended to be present for everything. Marsh looked at Cross for a moment. "Captain," he said. "This is a private—" "Sergeant Callahan has not requested privacy, sir," Cross said. "And given the circumstances, I'd like to stay." Marsh looked at him the way senior officers looked at junior officers who were being inconvenient, assessing, calculating the cost-benefit of forcing the issue. He let it go. "Sergeant Callahan." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had done this before, who had sat in rooms like this and managed problems like this, and who was good at it. "First, let me say that what you accomplished last night was extraordinary." "Thank you, sir. The after-action is going to require a thorough review, of course. Multiple parties involved, significant casualties on the opposing side, questions about the command decisions leading up to the engagement, questions like why she was left alone on an active base," Cross said. Marsh didn't look at him. "Questions that will be addressed through proper channels." "I'd like to understand the timeline for those channels," Maya said. Her voice was even. She was very tired, and the chest drain was doing its persistent reminder thing, and she was choosing to focus on the conversation as a problem rather than as something she was feeling. Specifically, the communication logs from last night, when my beacon went active and when the first response came. Those logs are part of the review. "I have copies," Cross said. A silence that was not comfortable. "Captain Cross," Marsh said, and now there was something harder underneath the measured tone. "You are aware that the documents you removed from Viper Ridge prior to evacuation may represent a breach of—" "The documents I secured from an active operational site during a hostile contact, sir, yes." Cross met his eyes, including the equipment registration in the armory locker and the communications logs from the TOC, which document both Sergeant Callahan's service history and the 5-hour gap between her emergency signal and the first human response. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Maya. "Sergeant," he said. His voice had changed register slightly, moving away from the opening position. "I understand you've had an extraordinarily difficult night, and I want to assure you that the questions you have—" "I have one question," she said. He waited. Karim Pass, she said. The room changed. Not dramatically. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. But the quality of the air in the room shifted in the way it shifted when something that had been in a box was no longer in a box, and everyone present was adjusting to the new configuration. Marsh's face did something careful and controlled. Delray, the JAG officer, looked at a point on the wall. The aide near the door was very still. That operation is classified, Marsh said. Carefully, like he was picking his way across ground he couldn't see clearly. I know, she said. I was in it. Sergeant, 5 people died, she said, and the people responsible for the intelligence failure that put them in a compromised insertion site have never been held accountable for that. And I know that because I have been in a logistics coordinator's uniform for 11 years watching nothing happen. She paused. Last night, an opposing force found redacted military records and read enough through the redactions to tell me things about that operation that I hadn't heard said out loud since 2012, which means the security around those files is not what it's being represented as. Marsh said nothing. Which means, she continued, that the information is not secure. It is only officially unacknowledged, and there's a difference. She looked at him steadily. I'd like that difference acknowledged. What you're describing, Marsh said slowly, is a very serious set of allegations. It's a statement of what happened. Allegations require evidence. Captain Cross has the locker contents and the communications logs, she said. I have 11 years of documented service records that show a pattern of deliberate sidelining. I have a fragment in a surgical tray somewhere in this building that was put there by a force that had my name from intelligence sources, which raises questions about what those sources accessed. She paused. And I have the name of the asset from Karim Pass, who is alive and who, if asked, would probably have things to say. Delray wrote something on his notepad. Marsh looked at Cross. Cross looked back. I'd like to speak with Sergeant Callahan privately, Marsh said. She hasn't requested that, Cross said again. Captain, I am ordering you to, Sir. Cross's voice was respectful and absolutely immovable. With respect, sir, I drove 31 kilometers on a mountain road in the dark and breached an active contact because this command structure left a single soldier on a base that was about to be overrun. And I documented everything. If there's something you'd like to say to Sergeant Callahan that you don't want on record, I would encourage you to think carefully about whether that's a sentence you want to finish. The room held it. Marsh looked at Maya. Maya looked at Marsh. She was not angry. She was past the point where anger was a useful tool, past the point where she needed the energy of it to keep her upright. She was just tired and clear and very sure about the specific thing she was asking for. I want a formal review, she said. Independent. Outside this command structure. I want the Karim Pass operation reviewed. I want the communications logs from last night reviewed. And I want my service record reviewed starting from the date of my reassignment. She paused. That's it. That's what I'm asking for. I'm not asking for anything that isn't standard procedure when there are questions about a classified operation and the handling of its personnel afterward. Marsh was quiet for a long moment. I'll need to make calls, he said. I understand. This is going to take time. I've been waiting 11 years, she said. I have time. He stood. The aide with the briefcase moved toward the door. Delray closed his notepad. At the door, Marsh stopped. He turned back to look at her. Not the way he'd looked at her when he came in, not the assessing, managing look. Something else. Something that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of discomfort. What you did last night, he said. Viper Ridge. She waited. For what it's worth. He stopped, started again. The UAV package had eyes on the grid from 2100. We have footage. A pause. The review board is going to see it. She didn't say anything. He left. Cross stayed. He sat back in the chair after they were gone and rubbed his face with both hands in the way of someone who had been managing his expression for the last hour and was now releasing it. Review board, he said into his palms. That's something. It's a starting point, she said. You think they'll actually convene one? I think the alternative is a lot messier for them. She shifted against the pillow, adjusting for the chest drain. The UAV footage is the interesting part. If Marsh mentioned it, it's because he's already watched it and he's calculating what it means for the review. Cross dropped his hands and looked at her. You knew they had footage. I assumed they had footage. Marsh confirmed it. She paused. When you said they had a UAV package on the grid, eyes on the valley, that doesn't mean they were watching in real time. It means the UAV was recording. The recording exists. She looked at him. Someone in an office somewhere has been watching that footage for the last 8 hours. He was quiet. What's on it? He said. She thought about the night, about the positions she'd moved through, the shots she'd taken, the time she'd spent on the north wall with the concertina wire, and the time she'd spent on the roof of the barracks, and the 6-minute period when she'd been sitting behind the deuce frame with her hand on her side watching the sky get lighter. 6 hours of one person defending a 400-meter perimeter against 70+, she said, in the dark, with what was in that locker. Cross looked at her for a long moment. They put you in logistics, he said. Not a question, not an accusation, just the statement of a fact that he was still finding the shape of. They did. Because you were too capable to leave in the field and too much of a liability to promote. He shook his head. So they just made you disappear, gave you a job that didn't matter on a base that didn't matter. And then the base mattered, she said. He made a short sound, not a laugh, something adjacent to it. What happens to you now? He said. I mean, after the review, if it goes the way you're saying. She looked at the ceiling again. The water stain was still there in the shape of nothing in particular. I haven't thought past the review, she said, which was mostly true. The part that wasn't true was the part of her that had been thinking about it during the quieter moments of the night, between positions, between shots, in the minutes when the base was silent and she was alone with her own head. She'd been thinking about the next generation of people who would come through bases like Viper Ridge, would be left behind on manifests by commanders like Graves, would spend their careers in support roles that didn't match their capability because someone had decided it was convenient. She'd been thinking about what it would mean to not be invisible anymore. Rest, Cross said, standing. We can figure out the rest later. She let him go. The room was quiet. Outside the small window, the FOB went about its business. Vehicles and voices, and the general background noise of a place that hadn't stopped running because one person's night had been extreme. She listened to it and felt her body making its case for sleep with increasing urgency. She gave in to it. She was still holding the question of what came next when the sleep took her, and she would still be holding it when she woke up, and that was fine. Some questions were worth carrying for a while before you set them down. She slept for 11 hours. Not the shallow drift she'd managed between positions in the dark at Viper Ridge, not the micro-rests her body had stolen in 30-second intervals behind sandbag walls and HESCO barriers. Real sleep. The kind that had weight and duration. The kind that took you somewhere below the level of dreaming and held you there until the body decided it had taken what it needed. She woke at 03:47 to the sound of a door closing somewhere down the corridor and lay in the dark for a while, listening to the FOB's night sounds and doing an inventory of what hurt. The answer was, most things, in a graduated hierarchy. The chest drain was the loudest complaint, followed by the knee, followed by the hand, followed by the forehead, followed by a general background ache that lived in her shoulders and lower back from 6 hours of sustained prone position on hard surfaces. She was alive, which made all of it acceptable. She lay there in the dark and thought about Reyes. She thought about him the way she'd learned to think about the dead over 11 years, not with the sharp grief of the early period, which had been close to unbearable, but with the particular quality of carrying something heavy that you'd gotten strong enough to carry. He'd had a daughter named Bean. The daughter would be 16. Somewhere in the country, a 16-year-old girl was living her life not knowing that there was a woman in a hospital bed on a forward operating base who had spent 11 years carrying her father's name. Maya didn't know if the review would change anything for that girl. Probably not. The review was not going to bring anyone back. It was not going to undo what had been done or make the 11 years not have happened. What it might do, what she was holding on to the possibility of, was create a record that said, these people existed, they did this thing, and the people who sent them and then buried them did not get to define how the story ended. That was not nothing. She reached for the water bottle on the bedside table and drank half of it and thought about what came after. The review board convened 6 weeks later. Not at FOB Kestrel, Not at any forward location. At a facility outside Washington that had the specific institutional quality of a place designed to make people feel like their problem was being taken seriously without committing to anything about what seriously meant. Conference rooms with good lighting, carpeted hallways, coffee that was better than field coffee and worse than anything you'd actually choose. Maya came in civilian clothes because she was technically on medical leave and had not been returned to active duty status, a bureaucratic ambiguity that the people managing the process had either created deliberately or had allowed to persist without correction. She wore a dark jacket over a collared shirt, and the knee brace her physical therapist had fitted her for, and she walked with a slight unevenness that would probably resolve and might not. Cross was there. He'd been formally notified of a review of his conduct during the Viper Ridge evacuation. The reassignment request Graves had filed had become part of the official record, which meant it had to be addressed as part of the overall process. He met her in the hallway outside the main conference room, and they stood together for a moment in the way of people who had been through something that was hard to reference in normal conversation. "How's the rib?" he said. "Mostly healed. The drain site is still—" She made a gesture. "It itches." "That's healing." "So I'm told." She looked at the door. "Who's in there?" "2 brigadier generals, an inspector general representative, 2 JAG officers, a civilian from, I don't actually know which agency. She didn't specify." "Did Marsh come?" "Marsh retired," Cross said. She looked at him. "Medical reasons," he said, with the specific neutrality of someone conveying information without editorializing. "Announced 3 weeks ago, effective immediately." She processed that. "And Graves?" "Graves is in there." Cross paused. "He came voluntarily, which either means he's confident or he's been advised that voluntary cooperation looks better than the alternative." She nodded slowly. "There's one more thing," Cross said. He looked at her with the careful expression of someone delivering information they're not sure how the recipient will receive. "Garrett is here." She went still. "He reached out through the IG office," Cross said, after the Viper Ridge action got attention. "When people started pulling the Kareem Pass operation code, he found out through whatever network he has. I don't know the details. He asked to provide a statement." A pause. "He's in a room down the hall. He asked if you'd be willing to see him before the proceedings." She looked at the carpet, at the pattern of it, neutral institutional gray-blue, the kind of carpet chosen specifically to not be memorable. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." His name was Daniel Garrett, and he walked with a cane, which was new since the last time she'd seen him, which was 14 years ago in a debriefing room where they'd both said very little because they'd been advised to say very little and because they'd been too exhausted to fight the advice. He was thinner than she remembered. His hair had gone fully gray, not the silver at the temples of someone aging gracefully, but the overall gray of someone who had had a hard time of it. He was sitting when she came in, and he stood when she entered, which cost him something. She could see it in the way he shifted his weight to the cane, and she almost told him not to bother and didn't because she understood why he'd done it. They looked at each other for a moment. "You look terrible," he said. "You look worse," she said. Something moved across his face that was the oldest version of a smile. They sat. "I saw the after-action summary," he said. "Someone sent it to me anonymously. I don't know who." He looked at his hands on the table between them. 6 hours. 5.5, approximately. Alone. Mostly. He looked up. Maya. Just her name. The way he said it held about 14 years of things that hadn't been said, all compressed into 2 syllables. "I should have," he started. "Don't," she said. "I should have pushed harder, after. When they reassigned you, I was—" He stopped. "I was trying to survive my own version of it. The physical therapy, the rebuilding, and I told myself that you were capable enough to handle whatever they put you in, which was true. But it was also a convenient thing to tell myself, so I didn't have to—" "Daniel." She used his name the way he'd used hers. "We were both managing what we were managing. You didn't create the situation." I didn't fight it either. No, she said. Neither did I. Not until last month. He was quiet. What changed? He said. She thought about it. They put me on an empty base, she said, and then an army came, and there was nobody else. When there's nobody else, the question of whether to fight stops being complicated. He nodded slowly. His hands on the table were the hands of a man who'd done physical work in hard conditions, scarred at the knuckles, one finger that hadn't set quite right after something that had happened to it. She remembered when those hands had been shaking in the secondary exfil point on the third day, not from fear but from blood loss and cold, and the specific tremor of a body that had been pushed past what it could sustain. She had carried him 4 kilometers. He knew she'd carried him. She knew she'd carried him. They had never discussed it. I'm going to tell them everything, he said. In there, the insertion, the first hour. What Reyes said to me before. He stopped. Everything I know about the intelligence failure. The source I identified afterward that I reported through back channels and that was never officially acknowledged. She looked at him. You identified a source, she said. I identified a probable source, he said carefully. A planning level breach. I had a name. I reported it. Nothing happened. He paused. The name is in my statement. She sat with that for a moment. Is it someone still active? She asked. No, retired 8 years ago. Lives in Scottsdale. Plays golf, from what I understand. He said it without particular bitterness, which was its own kind of statement. Has been playing golf for 8 years while Reyes's daughter grows up without a father. She looked at the table. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay, you should tell them. She looked up. Tell them everything. He held her gaze. You're not angry, he said. Not a question. I'm tired, she said. Angry takes energy I don't have right now. Maybe later. She paused. I'm glad you're here, Daniel. He didn't say anything for a moment. I should have been here 11 years ago, he said. Yes, she said, but you're here now. The proceedings lasted 3 days. She testified for 4 hours on the first day, speaking into the specific silence of a room full of people who were listening carefully because the recording was running and everything said was part of an official record. She answered questions from the JAG officers and from the civilian whose agency she never did identify, and from one of the brigadier generals who had a quality of focused attention that she found reassuring. The quality of someone who was actually trying to understand what had happened rather than trying to manage what the understanding would mean. She described Karim Pass in more detail than she had described it since 2012, and the room was very quiet during those parts. She described the reassignment. She described 11 years of Viper Ridge and the bases before Viper Ridge, the accumulated weight of being made deliberately irrelevant, the specific quality of working in a role designed to make you invisible. She described the night itself, the preparations, the positions, the ammunition count, the voice on the radio and what he'd said. She described the fragment she'd found in her side an hour into the engagement that she hadn't reported because she couldn't afford to stop. When she finished, the room held the silence for a few seconds before anyone spoke. The brigadier general with the focused attention said, Sergeant Callahan, in your assessment, what was the primary factor that allowed you to hold that position for the duration? She thought about it. Time, she said. I'd spent 3 years on that base. I knew every weakness in the perimeter, every sight line, every piece of equipment that had been left behind, and why. The people who came over that wire had good intelligence about the base as it was documented. They didn't have intelligence about the base as I knew it. She paused. Institutional knowledge. The thing you lose when you treat a person like furniture. The general wrote something down. Graves testified on the second day. She was not in the room for his testimony. The proceedings had separate sessions for potentially conflicting witnesses, but Cross was there, and Cross reported to her afterward with the careful precision of someone who had listened hard and was transcribing accurately. Graves had been confident going in. He'd come with a lawyer and a prepared statement, and the posture of a man who had been in rooms like this before and had managed them successfully. He'd characterized his decision to leave Maya behind as a reasonable operational judgment under time pressure, a resource allocation decision, documented and justified in the evacuation order. Then they'd shown him the UAV footage. 6 hours and 11 minutes of it. Continuous. Multiple camera angles from the UAV package that had had eyes on the grid since 2100. The eyes on the valley that Graves had cited as justification for not leaving additional personnel. The same footage that had recorded, in thermal imaging and standard optical, the precise detail of what one person had done through a night that Graves had assessed as manageable. Cross said Graves had watched approximately 40 minutes of it before his lawyer requested a recess. He did not return from the recess with the same posture. His revised statement filed that afternoon characterized his decision as an error of judgment made under operational pressure and noted that he took full responsibility for the failure to respond to Sergeant Callahan's emergency signal with appropriate urgency. It was not, Cross said, a performance of remorse. It was the statement of a man who had seen the footage and understood what was now in the official record and had made the calculation that partial accountability now was preferable to full accountability later. Maya listened to this and said nothing for a moment. He watched the footage, she said. For 40 minutes, Cross confirmed. Then he stopped. She nodded. She understood why he'd stopped, not because of what the footage showed about her, because of what it showed about the 5-hour gap. The footage was time-stamped. The emergency beacon was time-stamped. The first human response to the beacon was time-stamped. The math was visible in the footage in a way that could not be revised or characterized or managed, because thermal imaging did not editorialize. Eat. On the third day, they asked her what she wanted. Not in those words. The formal language was about remedies and adjustments and appropriate recognition of service, but the question underneath the formal language was, what does a correct outcome look like to you? She'd thought about this. I want Kareem Pass declassified, she said. The operation code, the personnel records, the citation. I want Reyes and Holloway and Park and Fitzpatrick and Dumont to have their names on a record that acknowledges what they did and what it cost. Their families deserve that. She paused. I want the source Garrett identified in his statement investigated. I'm not asking for a specific outcome. I'm asking for an investigation that isn't managed by the same command structure that buried the original operation. The civilian whose agency she never identified wrote something. And for yourself? The Brigadier General asked. She looked at him. I want my service record corrected, she said. The gap from 2009 to 2014 documented accurately. The citation attached to the correct name. She paused. And I want to go back to work. As a logistics coordinator? No, she said. Not as a logistics coordinator. A chump. The formal findings took 4 months. She spent those 4 months at her sister's house in Bozeman, Montana, in a guest room that smelled like cedar and had a window that looked out over a backyard where her sister's 2 kids ran around in the afternoons doing the elaborate, meaningless games of children who had no idea there was a world outside that yard. She watched them sometimes from the window while doing her physical therapy exercises. The knee, the rib, the shoulder she'd apparently done something to at some point during the night that she hadn't noticed until a week after, and felt something she couldn't immediately name. It took her a while to identify it as rest, not the absence of danger, not the absence of pain or responsibility, or the complicated weight of everything that had happened and everything that was pending. Just the specific physical sensation of a body that was healing in a warm room while children played outside, and the understanding that this was something she was allowed to have. Her sister Rachel did not ask about Viper Ridge. She'd served for 6 years before a knee injury of her own had ended that chapter, and she had the particular understanding of someone who knew what the questions were and also knew when not to ask them. She cooked dinner and made the guest room available and occasionally sat with Maya on the back porch in the evening while the kids were in bed, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. The property taxes in Montana, which were apparently a source of significant local feeling, the elk that had come into the yard in October, the novel Rachel was trying to write and had been trying to write for 3 years. Cross called once a week. He'd been cleared of the conduct allegations. The review board had characterized his return to Viper Ridge not as insubordination, but as a command judgment call made in a context where the original command decision had been found deficient, language that was careful and institutional and meant that he kept his rank and his career. On the calls, he updated her on the process, and they talked about the case, and sometimes they talked about other things, and she noticed that the calls had started running longer than they needed to for the purpose of updates, and she noticed that she didn't mind. "They're talking about a new billet," he said on a call in late November. "Training and doctrine, SERE instruction, advanced field tactics, integrating some of the new generation into the kind of work that—" He paused, choosing his words. "The kind of work that used to be in your file." "Where?" "Fort Carson, initially. It could move." She was quiet. "That's not a desk," she said. "It's not a desk. It's not logistics. Definitely not logistics." She looked out the window at the backyard, which was covered in snow now, the kids having spent an enthusiastic hour building something that was supposed to be a snowman but had become increasingly abstract. "Send me the billet description," she said. The formal findings arrived on a Tuesday in December, in a document that was thorough and institutional and said, in the language of official records, exactly what she'd asked it to say. The Karim Pass operation was partially declassified. Not everything. Some of the source intelligence and the name that Garrett had identified remained under review pending a separate investigation that had been assigned to people she didn't know and would likely not hear from directly. But the operation code was attached to real names now: Reyes, Holloway, Park, Fitzpatrick, Dumont. The citation that had been filed unattributed was correctly attributed. The characterization of the operation as a failure was revised to acknowledge that the primary mission objective, the recovery of the asset, had been achieved under extreme conditions by the surviving personnel. Her service record was corrected. The gap from 2009 to 2014 was documented. The 11 years of logistics duty were not erased. She didn't want them erased. They were part of what had happened, part of the record. But they were contextualized accurately within a service history that now read like what it was. Graves received a formal letter of reprimand and was placed on a performance review track that effectively ended any possibility of further promotion. He was not court-martialed. She'd known he probably wouldn't be. The letter of reprimand was not nothing. It was on his permanent record, and the review board's findings were on the public record, and the UAV footage was in the official archive. But it was not proportional, and she had made peace with the gap between what was proportional and what was possible. The probable source that Garrett had named, the retired officer in Scottsdale, was under formal investigation. She would not know the outcome of that investigation for a long time, maybe years, and she had made peace with that too. Or she was working on making peace with it, which was closer to the truth. She called Garrett when the findings arrived. He picked up on the second ring. "You saw it," she said. "I saw it." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard in 14 years. Not happiness exactly, something quieter, the sound of a weight being set down. "The names are on the record." "The names are on the record," she confirmed, a silence that was not uncomfortable. Reyes would have hated all of this, Garrett said. The process, the forms, the 4 months of waiting. He would have complained about it the entire time and then bought the first round when it was done, she said. "Yeah." A sound that was almost a laugh. "Yeah, he would have." They stayed on the line for another minute without saying much, and then they said goodbye, and she thought it probably wouldn't be another 14 years before they spoke again. She reported to Fort Carson in February. The drive from Bozeman took most of a day, through country that shifted from the specific character of Montana into the different specific character of Colorado, the mountains present in both but wearing different shapes, and she drove it herself in a truck she'd bought used in Bozeman with the money she'd saved in 3 years of having nowhere to spend ace in anything and nothing she'd wanted to buy. The knee was mostly functional. The rib had healed. The shoulder she'd done the thing to had been addressed by a physical therapist who had been very specific about exercises she needed to do every day, and whose instructions she was following with more discipline than she'd applied to anything non-operational in years, because she was not interested in having a shoulder that didn't work. The billet was in an unmarked building on the southeast side of the installation, which she appreciated. She had spent enough of her life in the visible, marked official parts of military facilities. The unmarked building had a plain interior and a training schedule that was not simple, and a cohort of personnel who ranged from early career to mid-career and who had been selected for the program through a process she didn't fully know, but whose results she could evaluate in the first week just by watching them move and listening to how they talked to each other. They were good. They were going to be better. On her first day, she walked into the primary training room, and 31 people came to attention, and she told them to stand easy and looked at them for a moment. Their faces, their posture, the way they held themselves in the ambiguity of a first day with a new instructor, trying to calibrate what she wanted and who she was and how much she was going to be a problem. "I'm Sergeant Callahan," she said. "I am not going to tell you about my background. You'll find out as we go, or you won't. And either way, it's not relevant to what we're doing in this room." She looked at them steadily. "What is relevant is this. Every skill I'm going to teach you exists because someone, somewhere, needed it and didn't have it. Some of those people survived not having it. Some of them didn't." She paused. "I'm not interested in being inspirational. I'm interested in being useful. If that's what you're here for, we'll get along." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. One soldier in the third row, young, sharp-featured, the kind of person who reminded her slightly of Cross at his most intense, raised her hand. "Sergeant Callahan." Her voice was careful. "Is it true that you held Viper Ridge alone for 6 hours?" The room was very still. Maya looked at her. 5 hours and 48 minutes, she said. "And the reason it wasn't longer is that somebody drove back for me, which is a lesson you should write down. It's not just about what you can do alone. It's about whether you've worked with people who'll turn around when you need them to." She let that land. "Any other questions before we start?" Nobody had any other questions. She turned to the board and picked up a marker and began to write. And the 31 people in the room leaned forward, and that was the beginning of something. Cool. Cross came to Fort Carson in April, 2 months later, on an official visit that was officially about coordination between his unit's training requirements and the new program. He found her after the formal part of the visit, on a range where she was running a low-light navigation exercise, and he stood at the edge of the range for a while watching the trainees move through the course before she noticed him and came over. "How are they?" he asked. "Getting there," she said. "The one in the back, Reyes." She stopped. He looked at her. "Her name is Reyes," she said. "Coincidence? She's good. She thinks faster than she moves, which is going to be a problem until she learns to trust her body, but she'll get there." He nodded. They stood watching the course for a moment. "You look different," he said. "I look the same." "You look like someone who knows what they're doing here." She considered that. "I always knew what I was doing," she said. "They just put me somewhere it didn't show." He smiled at that, a real one, not the careful managed expression of the FOB and the conference rooms and the months of process. She'd seen him smile before, in passing, but this was the kind that came without preparation. "I put in for a transfer," he said. "Fort Carson. There's a coordination billet that—" "I know about the billet," she said. He looked at her. "I may have mentioned to the right person that it should be offered to someone with specific experience in QRF coordination and forward command decisions," she said. "That's all." "That's all," he said. "Don't make it into more than it is." "I'm not making it into anything," he said, but he was smiling when he said it, and she let him. Well, in June, on a day that was warm enough that the trainees had been complaining about the heat, in the way young people complained about the heat when they had never been truly cold, she received a letter. No return address. Postmarked Scottsdale, Arizona. Inside was a single piece of paper with a single sentence written in a hand she didn't recognize. "I knew, and I told myself it was necessary, and I have been wrong about that for 13 years. No signature." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in a desk drawer and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office in the unmarked building at Fort Carson, with the sound of trainees moving on the range outside and the late afternoon light coming through the single window at an angle that was almost pleasant. She did not write back. There was nothing to write back. The letter was not an apology she had asked for or needed, and it did not change what had happened, and it was not addressed to Reyes or Holloway or Park or Fitzpatrick or Dumont, because none of them were here to receive it. But it existed. It was in the drawer, and the person who had written it had known what they'd done and had known it was wrong, and had written a letter that said so to a woman they probably knew could not verify it or prove it. And that act, small, insufficient, 13 years too late, was still an act of something, even if she could not immediately name what. She closed the drawer and went back to work. That evening, she sat on the steps outside the unmarked building as the light went down and thought about a version of herself that had stood in a motor pool at 0614 watching a convoy pull out and had known, even then, that the choice of how to respond was still hers, even if none of the rest of it was. She thought about 5 hours and 48 minutes in the dark, and about what it turned out she was made of when everything comfortable and deniable was stripped away. She thought about 31 people leaning forward in a training room, and a girl named Reyes who thought faster than she moved, and a truck she'd bought herself in Bozeman with money saved on a base that was supposed to be the end of her story. She thought about Cross, who was somewhere in the process of a transfer paperwork that would bring him here, and about Garrett, who had picked up the phone after 14 years and said the things that needed saying, and about Rachel's kids building an abstract snowman in a backyard in Montana. She thought about Reyes and the weight of carrying that name, and the fact that carrying it had not broken her. It had, in ways she was only now beginning to understand, been what held her together. The light went flat and amber and then began to fail, and she stayed on the steps for a while after it was gone, in the comfortable dark, thinking about none of it and all of it at once. She was not the person she'd been before Kareem Pass. She was not the person they'd tried to make her into after it. She was something that had come through both of those things and was still, stubbornly, unmistakably, here. That was enough. It had always been enough. The tragedy was only in how long it had taken the world around her to agree. The people who get left behind are not always the weakest ones in the room. Sometimes they are the ones someone decided was safer to lose. And sometimes, when the night is long enough and the stakes are real enough, those are exactly the people who show you what holding the line actually means. Remember that the next time you write someone off, remember it the next time someone writes you off. The ones they forget are sometimes the ones who change everything.